So in this video we're going to show you how to make dado cuts 3 different ways for everybody's budget. We're going to make them with a skill saw or circular saw, a table saw which will employ a dado stack, which you could get at your local Lowe's, Home Depot, box store, a router with a straight cut bit in it, and a jig that you'll have to make to fit your router. The plans I got for this jig I got off of woodarchives.com, and I'll put a link in the description below. I chose this one out of the multitudes of ones you could choose from because it comes with a built-in clamping mechanism for clamping the jig right to your workpiece. You'll need a downcut spiral router bit or an upcut, but I prefer the downcut because you'll see the cut. A router, we get our bits from Whiteside, American made. The other plus side to this jig is you do not need a bushing set, which is in the picture, but you will not need it. Also, I have some hardwood and some scrap plywood, scrap half-inch plywood. The fence rails are cut out of 3/4 inch hardwood that's ripped down to 1 3/4 inches. The second half of the fence is cut out of 1/4 inch hardboard. I didn't have hardboard, so I just used plywood, and those are cut. The directions call for 3 1/4, but 3 1/4 was a little too small for my router, so measure your router base and cut these pieces according to how wide your base is. I then put a sacrificial fence on my table saw with my dado stack to cut the rabbets in the hardwood for the fence rails. Did a test piece to make sure that the rails would fit flush. These rabbets are cut to accept that 1/4 inch piece of hardboard, or in my case 1/4 inch piece of plywood, and they're a 1/2 inch from the edge. Once I had my 2 rabbets cut, I put some glue in the joint and attached the 1/4 inch plywood with some brads just to hold it in place while the glue. Next, you cut a 1/4 inch dado on one of the rails, which will receive the steel pin for the clamping mechanism. That 1/4 inch dado should be 3/8 inch deep and 1 inch from the edge of your fence. On that same piece, you're cutting a 5/16 dado centered on the stock, which will hold the threaded rod. Once those 2 dados are cut, you can put your straight bit in your router and run it down both sides of the fence. Now my router has a flat side and a rounded side, so in order for the jig to work, you always have to orient the router the same way. I marked the fence for which side aligns with which and switched it to cut both sides. So on the second fence, you could see I flipped the router so the flat side's riding along the fence. On the end of each fence, you now cut out a recess for your router bit access, just so you don't nick up the jig. Next, I cut out the two plates that the fences will be attached to according to the dimensions in the plans. You drill a hole for a 5/16 inch carriage bolt, 1 5/8 inches from one end, and then counterbore out the bottom of the hole so it's flat and the carriage bolt sits in there recessed so it doesn't hit your workpiece. Do the same thing for the bottom plate. Cut it out according to the dimensions, center the carriage bolt, and counterbore out the bottom. Then I took some leftover 3/4 inch hardwood, 1/2 inch plywood, and attached them together with glue and brads. These will be all the caps for the two ends of the jig. Once you have it in one piece, you could take it to your saw and cut out the sizes you need. The two caps on the adjustable sides of the fence need mortises, so I marked where those mortises go according to the directions and attached them with brads. To make these mortises, I just drilled consecutive holes using my drill press. With something like this, it's not super important. The mortises are perfectly straight and look pretty. So doing it on the drill press was the fastest way to get this done. To remove the excess wood in between the holes I drilled for my mortise, I just slowly lowered the bit and dragged the piece away from the bit to take away the excess. I would not recommend this technique if you've only used the drill press a couple of times, as it could pull the piece away from you pretty quickly. I then attached the caps and the fixed fence rail to the bottom plate with glue and brads. It's super important that you keep checking this step for square, because if it's not squared, none of the dados when you use this jig will turn out square either. With the mortises cut out, you can now attach the adjustable side of the fence to the jig using your 5/16 carriage bolts and 2 star knobs. Instead of buying a knob for the jig, I just used an old piece of a wooden chair I had lying around, drilled a hole, and added a threaded insert to fit the 5/16 threaded rod for the jig. Next, I marked and cut all the dimensions for the clamp base with my jigsaw. The hole for the steel pin is going to be 2 7/8 from the edge and 7/8 inch down. I added the 1/4 inch steel rod to the hole I just drilled and cut it down because it was oversized. With the 5/16 hole cut, you line it up on your table saw to rip that hole perfectly in half. From that leftover piece of 5/16 threaded rod, I cut a 3/4 inch little nub that's supposed to be epoxied in place on that piece of wood that was just cut on the table saw. I don't have epoxy, so I just use hot glue for the time being. You attach the clamp base onto your jig with that steel pin riding in the dado that you cut. You're supposed to use veneer as a spacer so that the clamp top can ride along that edge without binding. I didn't have veneer, so I just used 4 playing cards, which will work fine for what it is. And then screw the top into the whole unit. With everything screwed in, you can now see if the clamp will work. If you pivot it on that steel pin riding in the dado, you can move it, and as soon as you lock it in place, it can't be moved. To use the jig, I marked a line on a piece of scrap wood and set the fixed part of the fence on that line. Moved the clamp and then tightened it with the handle I made. And the table saw will shake, but the jig is not moving. I put my downcut bit in my router and use a spare piece of 3/4 inch plywood to move the adjustable fence to get the size of the dado I wanted cut. I oriented my router according to flat side and round side on my two fences and cut out my dado. There's only a 1/4 inch bit in here, so I had to do a couple passes. You can unattach the jig and check for fit, and this was the first time I used this jig and it was a perfect fit. I usually cut my dados with the dado stack and the table saw. It's easy to set up, and with the fence, if you have to cut a bunch of multiples, you'll know they'll be aligned properly every time. Plus, since 3/4 inch plywood, which is what I usually use for dados, is actually 23-30 seconds, the set comes with special shims that you can place intermittently in the set to get the exact size you need. Putting your stock against your blade tells you exactly how thick you're going to cut through your piece. Then it's simply a matter of setting your fence and running your plywood through the table saw. This method is for people on a budget who might just want to make something they saw on Pinterest real quick and not buy a table saw or make a jig. It's a simple matter of getting a straight piece of wood, clamping it whatever distance your blade is from the fence, and making 2 rip cuts down your piece. This step becomes much easier if you have a fence that attaches to your circular saw. I have one, but it doesn't fit this saw. But if you have one of these, you don't have to do so much measuring and line up your fence, because that jig will do it for you. You can put the saw on top of your piece of wood as a depth gauge to see how far you're going to cut into your workpiece. Once the fence is lined up, you can just rip down your workpiece, flip it, and then do the same on the other side, cutting just right inside the mark. Once you have your 2 outside cuts, you can go through and cut a series of kerfs to take out the excess in the middle. Just be careful not to cut into those original 2 marks. And then remove any leftover bits of plywood with a chisel.